The airplane is the safest means of transportation. Alas, even today, some of them can crash. But what modern passenger airplanes cannot do is disappear without a trace or reason. And yet, there exists the story of Flight 370. On the night of March 8, 2014, a Boeing 777 takes off from the airport in the capital of Malaysia. Destination: Beijing, China. This is a regular daily flight with Malaysia Airlines. On board are more than 200 passengers and crew members. 30 minutes after takeoff, the captain of the aircraft makes his last contact with the ground. 40 minutes later, the Boeing not only disappears from radars, it vanishes entirely, along with 200 passengers. In the end, this case becomes one of the greatest mysteries in aviation history. In the investigation of the incident and the search for the aircraft, several countries will participate, spending several years and hundreds of millions of dollars. And yet, to this day, no one, from official authorities to participants in conspiracy forums, can provide a definitive answer. What happened? Did someone hijack the plane? Was it a terrorist attack? Did equipment fail? Did the captain take his own life? Did lightning or a meteor strike the plane? Was it shot down by the military? Those connected to aviation know well that a large modern passenger airplane cannot simply vanish like that. Advanced equipment on board the aircraft, radars on the ground, satellites in space, all of this precisely shows where the plane is at any given moment in flight. Even if it crashes, the equipment will indicate where, when, and ultimately why. But none of this applies to the case of Flight 370. 10 years later, no one knows what happened to it. In this video, we will attempt to unravel the mystery of the missing Boeing. We will fully trace the chronology of the flight, examine reports, analyze versions, and understand where the truth is most likely hidden. Okay, let's clarify a few technical details right away to avoid further confusion. The missing Malaysia Airlines plane had the code number MH370. This name appears in all English-language sources. In Russian-speaking spaces, it's most often called Flight 370. I will use both variants. The model of the missing plane is Boeing 777. This is one of the largest and most advanced types of airliners in the world. Both have 3 digits, both have 7s. People unfamiliar with aviation might get confused. So, the first is the code of the specific flight. The second is the model of the aircraft produced by Boeing. Basically, that's all you need to know before we dive into the story of the disappearance of Flight 370. March 8, 2014. It's a quiet, clear night. The Boeing 777 is preparing for takeoff from the airport in Malaysia's capital, Kuala Lumpur. Destination: Beijing, China. This is a daily flight for Malaysia Airlines, about 5 to 12 hours en route. The forecast predicts good weather conditions throughout the flight. Only some turbulence is expected, but that's not a problem for modern airplanes. The captain of MH370 is Zahari Ahmad Shah. He is 53 years old. He has spent more than 30 years flying for Malaysia Airlines, including on the Boeing 777 model. A very experienced specialist with an impeccable professional reputation. The first officer is Farik Abdul Hamid, 27 years old. His experience is limited 4 years. For Farik, this is a training flight on the Boeing 777 model. He has only made a few flights on it. Nevertheless, the fact that the young man was able to get into the first officer's seat of a large airliner speaks to his good professional qualities. In addition to the 2 pilots, there are 10 crew members, each with extensive experience, from 10 to 30 years. On board are 227 passengers from various countries, but the overwhelming majority, almost 2/3, are Chinese citizens. Before takeoff, MH370 was, of course, refueled. The fuel should last for 7.5 hours of flight, that is, 2 hours more than necessary. This is standard practice and not the most interesting detail. However, given what happens later, even the most insignificant details acquire some importance, including the amount of fuel loaded. Another important detail that definitely deserves attention is the timing. At 0:40, Captain Zahari receives clearance for takeoff. At 1:01, the Boeing climbs to cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. That's about 10.5 kilometers. Cruising altitude, in simple terms, is the level at which the airplane spends most of the flight. The captain's voice sounds quite natural and relaxed. His communication with the ground dispatcher proceeds as planned. MH370 is clearly visible on all radars, and the flight is proceeding normally. Nothing suspicious, but just 7 minutes later, strange things begin to happen. At 1:08, Captain Zahari reports to the ground that the airplane is at 35,000 feet. What's strange about this message is not its meaning, but the fact of its existence. 7 minutes earlier, the captain had already reported to the ground that the plane was at 35,000 feet. The second message was clearly unnecessary and suspicious. Could have appeared for several reasons, but we'll talk about them a bit later, because right after this message, truly astonishing things start happening with the airplane. 11 minutes later, Flight 370 is over the South China Sea. It leaves Malaysian airspace and enters Thai airspace. The Kuala Lumpur dispatcher instructs Zahari to contact the Vietnamese dispatcher in Ho Chi Minh City and says goodbye. Zahari says goodbye in his response message. And this message is interesting for two reasons. First, the dispatcher mentioned 5 digits in his farewell. This was the radio frequency. Zahari, according to the rules, should have repeated it, but he didn't. Second, this captain's message becomes the last one. The plane never contacts Vietnam. Almost immediately after that, the aircraft disappears from radars. At that moment, one of the greatest mysteries in aviation history began. The place where I am now is known to everyone. Just look at that sign on the hill. This is Hollywood, the center of the global film industry. However, not everyone knows that the sign was originally longer and, most importantly, had nothing to do with cinema. 100 years ago, the sign appeared as part of a marketing campaign to sell real estate in the nearby district of the same name. The letters were erected for only a year and a half and were planned to be removed. However, at the same time, the golden age of cinematography was beginning here. Gradually, the sign became associated exclusively with it. In the process, 4 letters at the end were removed, leaving only the word Hollywood, named after the Los Angeles district where major premieres took place and several film studios were located. Marketing and advertising are an integral part of our lives and even history. Practically everything around us has been touched by marketers. That is, marketer is a super in-demand profession. Tools and products are increasing. The requirements for specialists are growing. Therefore, the Financial University and the educational platform Natology have launched an online master's program in product marketing and analytics. Let me say right away that this is not just courses. This is a full-fledged higher education. The Financial University is among the top 10 best universities in the country, and Natology has been teaching online for 13 years, ensuring modern approaches and up-to-date knowledge. Product marketers are responsible for all product promotion and coordinate the work of the entire team. Salaries for specialists with 1 to 3 years of experience are 100 to 150,000 rubles and higher. Teaching will be done by university professors and employees of large companies, including Spare, Tinkoff, and Yandex. There will be a lot of practice. Students will go through all stages of promoting a digital product, from market research to analyzing effectiveness. There will be internships, real projects, and tasks of a product marketer, resulting in a ready portfolio and a master's diploma from the Financial University. The training is fully online. At the same time, it is full-time with all benefits and deferment from the Army. But lectures and seminars can be watched even from a phone. No need to move from your city or waste time commuting to the university. It can be combined with work and other affairs. And with a preferential educational loan, the cost will be from 263 rubles per month. Applications for the online master's program in product marketing and analytics are already open. Follow the link in the description or scan the QR code to get a manager's consultation. The number of spots in the program is limited. Of course, the first thing that comes to mind when a plane disappears from radars is that it simply crashed. However, as it turns out later, Flight 370 spent many more hours in the sky. Moreover, the place where the aircraft became inaccessible to radars can be called ideal. The plane is no longer in Malaysian airspace and not yet, as it were, in Vietnam's airspace. In short, This is the perfect moment if someone wanted to make the plane invisible. Everything that happened to the aircraft after disappearing from radars is the main subject of investigations, speculations, and conspiracy theories. We will rely on facts, and over the last 10 years, quite a few have accumulated. And first, we need to clarify the meaning of the phrase disappeared from radars. There are some technical details that are important for understanding the whole story. Throughout the flight, a passenger airplane remains visible to radars. These radars are divided into two types. The first are those that look like huge vertically standing dishes. Roughly speaking, they send a signal toward the aircraft and read what is reflected from the object. This is a somewhat old-school technology, and therefore not very accurate in determining the plane's position or speed. In addition, such radars have a limited range. Mainly, systems monitoring air traffic today rely on the second type of radars. They receive information from transponders located on board the aircraft itself. The information includes position, altitude, speed, and other aircraft indicators. Thanks to this system, for example, a site like Flight Radar works. Anyone can observe passenger airplanes in real time that are in the sky anywhere in the world. The problem with this technology is as follows. The plane will cease to be visible to such radars if the transponders on board fail or if someone turns them off. Now let's return to the events of that night on March 8, 2014. What happened on the ground after Flight 370 disappeared from radars? The dispatcher in Kuala Lumpur initially noticed nothing. Apparently, he was busy with other planes at that moment. When he finally noticed the absence of MH370 on the radars, he assumed that the plane was already beyond his territory in Vietnamese airspace. The Vietnamese dispatchers at the same time recorded how Flight 370 entered their airspace and then disappeared from radars. According to the rules, they should have contacted their colleagues in Kuala Lumpur within 5 minutes if the captain of Flight 370 did not establish contact with them. However, the Vietnamese did not do that. Instead, they unsuccessfully tried to contact the aircraft themselves for almost 20 minutes and only then relayed the information to the Malaysians. The dispatchers in Kuala Lumpur, in turn, contacted Malaysia Airlines, and they replied that everything was fine. According to their data, the plane was flying as planned over Cambodia. As it turned out later, such data was based not on the actual position of the plane, but on the preliminary plan that the airline had. But around 2 a.m., all parties agreed that the flight was going according to plan, and none of them noticed the faint signal from those old-school radars. According to them, the aircraft did indeed continue flying, but in a completely different direction from the planned one. Due to the dispatcher's inaccuracy, no one notified the Malaysian aviation authorities about the missing plane within an hour, as required by the rules. Another 4 hours passed before that moment. Only when MH370 did not land at the scheduled time in Beijing did the situation become an emergency, and the plane was declared missing. The search for the aircraft began in the South China Sea. This is, in general, logical. That's where contact with the airliner was lost. Several dozen planes and ships from Malaysia and Vietnam combed the sea area. However, no traces of MH370 were found. Only several days after the disappearance, thanks to collected readings from primary radars as well as military radars, it became clear that Flight MH370 first made a sharp, almost 180-degree turn between Vietnam and Malaysia, crossed Malaysian territory, bypassed Indonesia, and turned sharply south, after which it flew for several more hours and finally disappeared. The aircraft's flight path indicated one thing. This was not an accident, not a technical failure. This was almost certainly a well-planned action. But why, for what purpose, and where, finally, is the plane and the 200 passengers? Searching for a needle in a haystack is not easy, but the real problem is when you don't even know where the haystack is. This roughly describes the situation the Malaysian authorities found themselves in when it became clear that the Boeing 777 did not crash in the South China Sea. Moreover, initially, information about the strange path of Flight MH370 came not from official sources, but from journalists. Only after that did the Malaysian authorities confirm the accuracy of the media data. Some time later, a London-based company called Inmarsat appeared in the incident story. They deal with commercial satellites, and passenger aviation is not really their specialty. However, in this situation, it turned out that Inmarsat's satellite data plus ground radar data could, with a high degree of probability, reconstruct the full route of Flight 370 and also rule out several of the most obvious versions of what happened. The entire path of the Boeing can be divided into two parts. We know about the first from civilian and military radars, and the second was reconstructed from satellites. The route of the first part of the flight, 40 minutes until the transponders were turned off, and another hour after, no one doubts. And here's why this is important. The most obvious version of what happened initially was an emergency situation. Some systems failed, or there was an ignition or some other emergency. It was this that disabled those transponders on board that transmit information to the ground. Such cases have occurred. In 2010, a UPS Boeing 747 cargo plane crashed in Dubai due to a fire on board. The investigation found that the cause of the fire was ignited lithium batteries that the plane was carrying as cargo. In 1998, a Swissair passenger plane crashed in Canada. The cause was a short circuit that caused a fire and failure of critical aircraft systems. On Flight MH370, there was also cargo. Part of it was lithium batteries. As the investigation later found, they could not have caused a fire and crash because they were packaged in a special way. But the main thing is that the version of a fire on board due to cargo or a short circuit was ruled out by the flight path and other details. The fact is that at the very moment when the transponders were turned off and the plane disappeared from radars, it did not happen all at once. First, one part of the transponder's functionality was disabled, and 37 seconds later, they were completely turned off. This means the cause was not a sudden situation like a fire or explosion, but a manual, gradual shutdown of the transponders, most likely from the cockpit. In addition, the sharp turn of the aircraft almost 180 degrees from the original route indicates that it was performed manually by someone. This could not have been the autopilot. Subsequent tests showed that the plane on autopilot cannot perform such a sharp turn. Suppose a fire occurred in the plane that disabled the transponders, and the pilots turned around to make an emergency landing. But they didn't. They continued flying further. Moreover, on that first part of the route reconstructed from radars, the plane continued to be controlled manually. This is indicated by minor oscillation side to side during the flight, which in turn rules out the version of the pilots losing consciousness, for example, due to smoke or cabin depressurization. From Inmarsat satellite data, the second part of the flight was reconstructed after MH370 disappeared from ground radars. According to this data, the Boeing flew for another 6 hours at high speed and high altitude toward Antarctica and finally disappeared in the southern part of the Indian Ocean. True, all this information was not known immediately. Because of this, searches were conducted in completely wrong places and, of course, led nowhere. In addition, time was lost. If the Malaysian authorities had immediately disclosed information about the strange flight path of the aircraft, perhaps the plane could have been found. Including for this reason, many people, among them some relatives of the missing Boeing's passengers, are convinced that the Malaysian authorities are covering up the true cause of what happened, that the plane perhaps did not crash at all or was shot down. We'll talk about these versions a bit later. Now let's focus on the search operation. It stretched over several years and became, by some estimates, the most expensive and large-scale search operation in history. Planes and ships from several countries combed hundreds of square kilometers over 2 months. First in the South China Sea, then in the Andaman Sea where the plane was last seen on radar, and finally in the southern part of the Indian Ocean where, according to Inmarsat data, the plane finally disappeared. After 2 months of unsuccessful attempts, the search operation focused on underwater research. Since the Malaysians lacked their own resources to study the depths of the Indian Ocean in the presumed area, the Australians joined the operation with more advanced equipment. Their main task was to locate the flight data recorders from the cockpit. Several years were spent, hundreds of square kilometers of seabed were studied. This cost more than $100 million. And yet nothing was found. Some time later, the searches were continued by the American commercial company Ocean Infinity. Under an agreement with the Malaysian authorities, the searchers would receive compensation only upon successful outcome of the searches. But after several months of studying the seabed in the presumed crash area in the southern Indian Ocean, nothing was found. In July 2015, 16 months after the plane's disappearance, Street cleaners on Réunion Island in the Indian Ocean discovered a strange object. As it turned out later, it was part of the wing of a Boeing 777 called a flaperon. Thanks to the serial numbers on the flaperon, it became clear that this was a piece not just of some Boeing 777, but of that very MH370. Subsequently, on the coast of Madagascar and nearby coastal areas, a total of 24 Boeing 777 debris pieces were found. Only a few of them can be definitively identified as debris from MH370. The rest are determined by experts as most likely belonging to the missing plane. However, the found debris, by and large, revealed nothing new about what happened. Based on satellite data, it was almost certainly clear that the plane crashed in the southern part of the Indian Ocean. Analysis of currents in this region only confirmed that the debris should have drifted somewhere to southeastern Africa. No traces of explosion or fire were found on the debris. This only added weight to the theory that what happened to Flight 370 was man-made. In 2018, a massive report was published with the results of the Malaysian authorities' investigation into the incident. The 450-page document mostly duplicated the technical specifications and features of the Boeing 777, the results of search operations, and radar data. The document's conclusion stated that determining the true causes of the plane's disappearance was not possible. However, even in this generally useless document, the authors acknowledged that the shutdown of transponders and other detection systems on board the plane was most likely the work of a human. And as we remember, the shutdown of these systems and the subsequent sharp turn of the aircraft occurred in the most ideal place to make the plane invisible. But who did it, and most importantly, why? Over the long years of investigating the incident, many theories have emerged. Some were based on available facts and calculations. Such theories were most often proposed by former or current pilots or other professionals connected to aviation. They carefully analyzed radar readings based on their own experience. And many of these arguments you have either already heard or will hear in the course of the video. However, at the same time, many other versions appeared. They can be called speculative or conspiratorial. Some of them became the basis for major documentaries about MH370, including, for example, on Netflix. Thus, one of the conspiratorial scenarios suggests that MH370 was initially shot down by American military from the Diego Garcia base in the Indian Ocean, either because the aircraft initially wanted to attack this base, or because the military shot down an unidentified passenger plane that was not responding to their signals. Afterward, allegedly, many radar data and debris were deliberately falsified to cover up what happened. Another scenario even claims that after turning over Indonesia, the plane flew not south, but north and crashed somewhere in Kazakhstan. The problem with these theories is that they contradict the numbers. In the professional aviation community, and we're talking about specialists from different countries around the world, there are no significant discrepancies in the route of MH370, which was mathematically calculated using various satellites and radars. But what even experienced pilots cannot say definitively is what really happened to Flight 370. There are different versions here. Now we'll examine them in detail. So, what we already know from the flight path, satellite, and radar data is that we are almost certainly dealing with a man-made act. Equipment failure or human error cannot explain what happened. Glitch in certain systems, icing, bird strike, lightning, meteor, volcanic cloud, mechanical failure, electronic failure, equipment error, fire, smoke, explosion, depressurization, bomb, missile. None of this can explain the path that Flight 370 took. By the time the transponders were turned off, control of the aircraft was most likely being handled by one of the pilots alone. It's hard to believe they were acting in concert. For both, this was their first joint flight, which means the pilot not involved in control at that moment either couldn't enter the cockpit because it was locked or was already unconscious. According to one version, the one at the controls after the first sharp turn climbed to an altitude of 40,000 feet while depressurizing the cabin. Oxygen in the masks for passengers in the cabin lasts only 10 to 15 minutes. That is, they all lost consciousness fairly quickly. At the same time, oxygen in the masks in the cockpit for pilots lasts several hours. In addition, at the moment when the plane sharply changed course, not only the transponders were turned off, but also some other electrical systems of the plane. Unknown for what purpose, but likely, among other things, to disable satellite communication systems with the plane so it became completely invisible to ground dispatchers. If it was exactly like that, then for the remaining 6 hours of flight, only one person remained alive on the plane, and he was at the controls. Another fact supports this theory. Almost an hour later, at 2:25, some electrical systems on the plane turned back on, including those responsible for satellite connection. Partly thanks to this, it was later possible to reconstruct the full route of the plane. In addition to the turned-on electrical systems, the cabin was repressurized. For everyone on board except the person at the controls, this made no sense. None of them would have been alive by then. So we are left with the question, who was at the controls? One of the pilots, or was the plane hijacked? Hijackings of planes are not exactly common, but alas, they happen. Surely some of you have watched the video about DB Cooper on my channel or know the story of September 11th. Yes, and besides that, there are plenty of such cases in aviation history. Only over time, security measures have constantly increased, and for someone unauthorized to enter the cockpit is practically impossible. On that Boeing model in 2014, the cockpit door was equipped with multiple levels of protection plus video surveillance so the pilots could see who was standing at the door. In addition, the plane's first disappearance from radars occurred just minutes after Captain Zahari casually said goodbye to the dispatcher. It's unlikely that during this time, the plane could have been hijacked by one of the passengers. Moreover, I said that the disappearance and sharp turn of the plane occurred at the most ideal moment between two airspaces of different countries. It's unlikely that hijackers could have chosen such a perfect moment, but suppose the hijackers did manage to enter the cockpit. For the captain or first officer to report this to the ground or transmit the corresponding signal, only a few moments are needed. But they didn't. One version of the hijacking of MH370 suggests that the hijackers could have turned off the transponders and some systems by sneaking into the compartment under the floor in the cabin, where many systems and sensors are located. True, it's hard to imagine that this happened unnoticed by more than 200 people on board. In addition to this, a large part of the incident investigation was devoted to studying the backgrounds of all 239 people on board, including crew members. In this, besides the Malaysians, FBI agents also participated. In the end, 2 passengers were found flying on fake passports. However, further investigation showed that these 2 passengers were Iranian citizens and had no connections to any terrorist organizations. Most likely, they were simply trying to reach one of the relatively safe countries and then apply for political asylum. And finally, what was the purpose of hijacking the plane? Terrorism, money, or politics? Everything that happened to MH370 over 7 hours of flight shows that none of this was likely the reason. Moreover, no one claimed responsibility for the incident, and anonymity is not a trait of terrorists. And thus, we are left with not so many versions. More precisely, 1, what happened was organized by one of the pilots. But who and why? Here it won't be superfluous to mention another conspiracy theory. There's an idea that the plane was actually controlled manually the whole time, but from the ground. According to this version, either Boeing was experimenting with new technology, or someone simply hacked the aircraft's control system. Neither idea is taken seriously by pilots or other industry professionals. First, because even theoretically imagining these scenarios is quite difficult, and second, analysis of the flight data indicates that control was directly from the cockpit. Thus, we move on to discussing those who were initially at the controls of the plane. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah and First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid. Pilots are not robots. Pilots are living people. Those who sit at the controls can also experience psychological problems, go through difficult life moments, face financial difficulties, and so on. All of this could potentially become a reason why a particular pilot might hijack a plane or decide to end their life while performing professional duties. Confirmation of this comes from real cases in civil aviation history. In 2014, an Ethiopian Airlines plane with 200 passengers was hijacked by the first officer. The aircraft was flying from Ethiopia's capital to Milan, Italy. During the flight, the captain went to the restroom. The first officer locked the cockpit door and took control. Then he landed in Switzerland and requested political asylum. No passengers were harmed. In 1999, An Egyptair Boeing on the New York-Cairo flight plunged into the ocean 30 minutes after takeoff. American investigators concluded that this was a deliberate act by the first officer, who turned off the engines and directed the plane downward. More than 200 people on board perished. In 2015, a Germanwings plane from Barcelona to Dusseldorf suddenly began descending and crashed in the Alps. As the investigation later found, this was a deliberate action by the pilot. He locked the cockpit door after the captain went to the restroom and directed the plane downward. Nearly 150 people perished. The reason for the first officer's behavior was serious mental problems that he hid from the airline. And these are not all such cases, just a few examples. Therefore, during the investigation, the pilots were checked especially thoroughly. Their biographies, medical records, relatives and bank accounts, homes and apartments. The first officer was 27-year-old Farik Abdul Hamid. No details of his life suggested that he could have committed a deliberate act of crashing. His finances and health were in perfect order. He was described by all acquaintances as an optimistic young man. Moreover, he was apparently about to get married soon. From a professional point of view, everything in Farik's life was also good. As I said, he had only recently been entrusted with the pilot's seat on the Boeing 777. This is a huge airliner, and getting such an assignment at a young age is prestigious. A great career awaited him. The only suspicious moment regarding the first officer is his phone. In the Malaysian investigators' report, it was stated that after the plane sharply turned from the planned route, the first officer's iPhone unexpectedly turned on. This happened over Penang Island, and the connection with the phone was established for a very short period. This was not an outgoing or incoming call. The cell tower on the island only registered contact with the device. What can this tell us? According to the rules, pilots' phones must be turned off during flight, which means someone turned on the first officer's phone already in the air. Perhaps it was him to make a call and report something, but this is only an assumption. The true reason for the short contact from the ground with the pilot's phone is unknown. Interestingly, information about Farik's iPhone appeared in the press thanks to a leak of Malaysian investigation materials. Many of these materials were never published and did not make it into the final 400-page report. Why? An interesting question with no definitive answer. Malaysian authorities are, of course, known for their corruption and lack of transparency, but why hide such facts is unclear. In any case, we have no even indirect data indicating that the first officer wanted to commit a deliberate act. Therefore, we move on to discussing the figure of the aircraft's captain, Zahari Ahmad Shah. Let me remind you that he was a very experienced pilot, 53 years old, of which more than 30 he flew on various Malaysia Airlines planes. Since 1998, Zahari had been a captain on the Boeing 777 model. The pilot had an impeccable professional reputation. He was married with 3 children. As investigators found, his finances and health were in perfect order. Colleagues characterized Zahari positively. He was stress-resistant. Before the flight, there was nothing suspicious in his behavior. Investigators, among other things, carefully analyzed video recordings from the airport before the flight. In them, posture, facial expression, and other signs do not reveal any deviations in Zahari. In his free time, the pilot tinkered with amateur electronics and flew on a home flight simulator. Zahari even had his own YouTube channel. In short, the captain also seemingly had no motives for committing such a terrible act. However, many details from the flight analysis suggested that the captain was the main suspect. The Malaysian authorities' report on the pilot raised suspicions for many. The fact is that articles began appearing in the media stating that in the captain's personal life, not everything was smooth. He allegedly lived separately from his wife and had mistresses. It should be noted here that these rumors were not publicly confirmed by Zahari's relatives. What was really strange was the flight simulator found in the pilot's home. Suspicious was not the fact of having such a device, but the flights Zahari performed on this simulator. Among hundreds of saved and deleted flight data, investigators' attention was drawn to a route that ended in the southern part of the Indian Ocean and quite closely resembled the real route of MH370, reconstructed from radars and satellites. That is, the captain may have been rehearsing this fateful flight on his simulator. After all, as I have already noted, many aviation industry professionals agree that everything that happened to the Boeing was well prepared. What makes this simulator data even stranger is the fact that information about such a flight was leaked to the press from a non-public report by Malaysian authorities. They only later acknowledged that the strange route on the flight simulator did exist, and it was originally deleted by Zahari himself and restored later by investigators. In the official report, Malaysian authorities conclude that this was not an attempt to rehearse the last flight of MH370, and some independent researchers agree with this. In their opinion, it's just a coincidence. On the other hand, if it was not a coincidence, then it turns out that Zahari really was rehearsing the route of Flight 370. As other independent researchers found, in this simulator flight, there is no landing point, unlike hundreds of others. The point of a simulator is that the person at the controls takes off, reaches the desired point, and lands at a specific airport. But in the case of this flight on Zahari's simulator, there was no landing point. From this, one thing becomes clear. The fact that Zahari was the main suspect in the incident for some time is completely understandable. But we cannot definitively state that it was he who committed the deliberate hijacking of Flight 370 and is guilty of its demise. For that, we lack concrete evidence. There are only indirect conclusions. One thing is clear for sure. The person who did this was very well prepared and knew what to do. And although data from several different researchers confirm the approximate crash zone in the Indian Ocean, we have no definitive answer as to how the final stage of the flight went. Was it a gradual descent of the aircraft due to fuel exhaustion, or a more abrupt man-made act of descending the aircraft and colliding with the ocean? This is quite important to understand the motives. It's obvious that the person sitting at the controls throughout the flight actively and deliberately performed the necessary actions. He turned the plane in the right places, turned off electronics, stayed as far as possible from radar coverage areas. Could it be that, in the final stage, he simply passively waited for the plane to run out of fuel? And yet, according to some calculations, the plane gradually descended, rather than being sharply directed downward. At the same time, some other calculations say the exact opposite. But what we know almost for sure is that the last hours of Flight MH370's flight already took place in daylight. And that means the one sitting at the controls, most likely the only living person on board, watched as a new day began. To this day, investigations into the incident and searches for Flight MH370 have been halted. Not a single body has been found, and no debris except those 20, which add no clarity to the situation. And that means neither the passengers' relatives nor the rest of the world know the exact causes and circumstances of the crash. The only hope for learning the final truth is to find more debris from Flight MH370. However, given the vast ocean space that needs to be studied and the hundreds of millions of dollars that would need to be spent again, the prospect of resuming searches is quite unlikely, and the case of Flight 370 will most likely remain one of the greatest mysteries in aviation history.